Hello, and welcome to today's training industry webinar, Level Up, Harnessing the Power of Gamification for Safety Training. I'm Liz Spate, Events Marketing Specialist here at Training Industry, and I'm thrilled to have you with us here today. Before we get started, I would like to quickly go over a few housekeeping items to help you interact with our speaker and get the most out of today's program. Throughout today's event, please feel free to use the chat window to interact with our speaker with any comments. And for any questions, please submit all questions to the Q&A section on your toolbar below. We will address all comments and questions throughout the event or at the end of the program during our Q&A section. We would also love to hear about what you've learned from today's session on social media. So please follow ELB Learning and hashtag TI webinars as you share your favorite takeaways with your colleagues. When the webinar ends, you should receive a short evaluation survey. We always welcome your feedback on things like the content, the speakers, topics, or anything else you would like to share with us. So please be sure to complete that at the end of the event. As always, today's webinar will be recorded and archived on trainingindustry.com, and you will receive a follow-up email from us that will include the link to the on-demand program for you to share with your team. If you've attended one of our programs in the past, thank you so much for joining us again. And if this is your first webinar with us, welcome. At Training Industry, we offer dozens of webinars with subjects ranging from AI, analytics, to onboarding, upskilling, and reskilling. We cover about every topic relevant to leaders of training organizations around the globe. Now, to get started, let me introduce you to today's speaker. Carl Kopp is a professor of instructional technology at Commonwealth University. Carl is the founder of the L&D Learning Academy, co-founder of the Enterprise Game Stack, a TEDx speaker, and an author of 9 books on the convergence of learning, technology, and business. So please give a warm welcome to Carl Kopp.
Hey, thank you. It's so exciting to be here and glad to talk about what's happening in the field of safety training and gamification. Two very important topics. I very much enjoy gamification, and safety is something that should be near and dear to all of our hearts. So if you want, you can follow me on LinkedIn. You can drop me an email message. LinkedIn, I do a newsletter, so that might be helpful as well. So what I want to talk about today are several items. One is, what is gamification, to help everybody understand kind of what that is. And there are actually 2 types of gamification, so I want to dive into each of those. And then I want to talk a little bit about the psychology. How does gamification actually work? Why does it work? How does it help us in achieving our learning and development and ultimately performance goals? Because that's what we want to aim for. And then finally, what are some examples of gamification and safety? Like, can I really see this working? And how does gamification maximize engagement, which is very important as we look at what we're doing. Now, let's start with the definition of gamification, because gamification has, I always laugh. Every time I talk to somebody, I get like 4 different definitions of gamification. It's just one person. So you'll hear different definitions, but my definition is using game-based mechanics, aesthetics, and game thinking to engage people, motivate action, promote learning, and solve problems. So that's the idea behind gamification. We really want to use it. And another maybe simpler definition is using game elements in places where you usually don't play games. And my wife works for a company that does safety training, and she said, Carl, I'm not really comfortable with you talking about safety and games. Safety is no game, and it's not. It's absolutely not a game. But we're not always making games with gamification. What we're doing is we're using the techniques from games to help with engagement. So it doesn't mean we're taking into a game or we're treating it like it's silly or anything like that. In fact, the opposite. It means we're taking a very serious topic and we're approaching it very seriously. And so that's what I mean by using gamification. Now, there's 2 types of gamification that I've defined in my research. One is called structural gamification, and that's using game elements to propel a learner through content with no alteration or changes to the content. So you did the same content that you would normally do, but you might get points because you completed the content. You might earn a badge, or you might find yourself on a leaderboard. So those are elements that you need to think about. Now, I want to just say a couple of words real quick about points, badges, and leaderboards. Sometimes they're called the evil trifecta of gamification because they trivialize what we're doing. And they can, absolutely. But if they're done right, they have a large impact. So points, for example, should be given for things that are difficult to accomplish, and they should give you feedback on how well you've done. So for example, if you could earn 10 points, but you only earned 5 points, it means you have some room for improvement. If you get the message that, hey, you could earn 10 points, but you've earned 9 points, you know you've done pretty well. So points should be used to give information about how well somebody has done something. Badges should be linked to a specific task and what you are doing to accomplish that task. And badges need to be earned. If you just give somebody a badge, then nobody will care about the badges. The other important thing about badges is that they should be recognized also outside of your gamified system. So for example, if I earn a badge for incident-free days, for example, that should be recognized not just in my system when I log on, but by my manager, maybe at a department meeting, maybe at a group meeting. You can't have gamification in the computer system and not talked about anywhere else. It needs to be part of the overall culture and safety initiative. And then finally, a leaderboard. Leaderboards are good when they're individual, but they're great when they're team leaderboard. What happens typically with an individual leaderboard is if you're in the top 10, you're psyched. Hey, I'm top 10. This is awesome. If you're number 11, you're not so excited. And if you're number 100, the leaderboard becomes demotivating. I'm never going to get on that stupid leaderboard. I'm not going to do anything about it. But once you have a team leaderboard, then people tend to want to be more involved. I don't want to let my team down. So if you do team leaderboards, it can be very helpful. But let me show you kind of what structural gamification looks like. So here, for example, is a screen of a learning board for structural gamification using a tool called Mind Tickle. And notice here I have a leaderboard here, individual leaderboard, and all of these elements I have on here. So for example, here is a badge that you can get for completing this course. Here are some another badge that I can earn. Notice I get points for each course that I take, and I have the leaderboard. So I'm still going to learn. I'm still going to go through the modules. I'm still going to do all of that, but I am now earning points or badges for that experience. And in fact, here is a video. You watch the video and you get scored on watching the video, whether or not you watched all of it or some of it. I can vote the video up or down, and notice I can get 100 points. I also then, if I answer questions, this tool gives me the ability to take those points and trade those in for lifelines. So if I earn so many points, I can get a lifeline to eliminate some of the wrong answers. And so it kind of goes through that process. And I get, in this case, 3 strikes, I'm out. If I get it right, I get more points. So basically, it's this structure. The content doesn't change. It's still a multiple choice question. It's still information that I would get anyway. But what happens is I get points as a motivational tool to help me through this content. And I can see at the end of the content, I get a badge, I get lifelines, I get all of that kind of stuff. So in this particular case, Amanda, it's a tool called Mind Tickle, but there's lots of different tools that do this. Exonify, ELB has an LMS, and what's called the Game Agency, Game Arcade. So there are lots of different tools that are out there, and many of them do this. And I've encountered a number of companies that have an LMS and don't realize that their LMS has some gamification elements to it. So you may want to just check out with whoever's administering your LMS and find out, hey, do we have game elements that we just haven't turned on that module? Or is that a capability? So that's something that could definitely be accomplished. Now, the second type of gamification is called content gamification. And that's where you use game thinking to alter the content itself to make the content more game-like. So it doesn't quite turn it into like, it's not a fun AAA Halo game, like, oh my gosh, this is the greatest game ever. But it takes content that you would typically teach and make it more game-like and more interesting. So you can do things like challenge, like add a challenge to the learning experience. I'm going to challenge you to accomplish this goal. I'm going to challenge you to solve this problem. And it puts it into a story context. And because stories are great for a learning perspective and a great for understanding the context in which the safety needs to occur. You have characters, people that you can relate to, and then you have missions like, hey, I'm going to go accomplish this, or I'm going to accomplish that. So all of these go into content gamification. So here's an example dealing with blood-borne pathogens. And so how this starts is at the beginning of the instructional element, you say, hey, you have to be on the lookout for organisms that can be found in blood. They're called blood-borne pathogens, and it shows you the different types of pathogens, hepatitis B and hepatitis C, etc. And then it says, okay, when you're going to handle the lab in the blood, you're going to blood in a lab, excuse me, you're going to have to deal with this. And so it has these different elements of story, of characters, which are the pathogens. And then finally, it has, you need to destroy them before they take over our organization. So it gives you a mission, right? Destroy them. And then finally, it gives you kind of this framework that you're working in. So you start at the bottom, you identify the hazards, then you move up to protect yourself, you avoid contamination, you dispose of the waste, and finally you get to the test. So all those are game-like elements that aren't points, badges, or leaderboards, but they're the story behind what's happening from the game perspective. It provides this context. It provides deeper and richer engagement because I want to accomplish the mission. It's human nature. Now, if we look at how gamification actually works, we see that there's a bunch of research out there that looks at psychological needs, the game mechanism. Remember how I said it was a mechanism that works there, and then the game element, right? So we have mechanism and we have element. So if we look at this, we can see all humans, we have a need for competence. We want to be seen as being competent. And actually, this is based on something called self-determination theory. SDT, self-determination theory. And it's a meta theory of motivation. Just typing that in there. Oh, I left off the ON on motivation, but you get the point, right? So it's self-determination. It's a meta theory of motivation. Basically, it says how and why are people motivated? People are motivated with three areas. One, they're motivated by a sense of autonomy, which means my ability to make my own decision. The second is my sense of mastery, which means I feel I can master this. So think about it yourself. If you've ever been in a situation where you feel like I'm never going to get this, I'm never going to learn this, I'm not going to be able to learn it, you're less motivated. If you're like, I think I can do that, then you're more motivated. And a great example of this is Roger Bannister. So Roger Bannister in the 1930s was the first human ever to break the 4-minute mile, which was pretty amazing because at one point, doctors actually thought it was physiologically impossible to break the 4-minute mile. Now, after he broke the 4-minute mile, the next year, 38 people broke the 4-minute mile. Why? Because they're like, hey, I know Roger. I beat him in a race. I can break the 4. If he can do it, I can do it, right? So that's that sense of I can do this, right? So we have autonomy, which is making your own decisions. We have mastery, which is like, I can get this. And we have what's called social relatedness or peer pressure, right? It's what we can boil down into peer pressure. But basically, if we look at these elements, let's see how they affect gamification. So one is we want to look at and think about these psychological needs, which I talked about. Then we want to look at the mechanism. So for example, when we want somebody to be confident, we have to give them granular feedback, like you did this behavior correctly. too often in gamified environments, we gamify the big overall goal, which I'll come to in a minute. We want to have sustained feedback. We want to have cumulative feedback. We want to give the learner choices. We want to have engagement, volitional engagement. We want to have a sense of relevance, like what does this mean? And we want to have a shared goal. So when you think about creating your safety-related gamification system or implementing it, you want to make sure, are we hitting these things? And how do we hit these things? Well, points are a way to get gradual feedback, as I already talked about. Sustained feedback is to give me a performance graph over time. Cumulative feedback, badges and leaderboards. Choices, I can make a choice in the story, or I have a choice with an avatar, like how I want my avatar to look. I can have a sense of relevance with the leaderboard, my teammates, as I said, group leaderboards, and a shared goal, which would be a meaningful story that I talked about as well. Now, gamification also helps with something called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. It turns out we as humans, after about 24 hours, we forget stuff that we learned. It goes away. So you probably had a situation where, like, I just told you not to do that, and you just did it, right? And now you're putting yourself and others in danger. Like, don't do that. You just had training on that. Why are you doing that? Like, doesn't make sense. Well, it does make sense if you think it psychologically, where it happens that we as humans forget things after we've learned them, really after 24 hours. And we keep forgetting and forgetting and forgetting until it goes away, unless we're reminded. Some people call that a booster. Some people call that spaced practice. Some people call that drip learning. But the whole idea is that when we are learning something, we tend to forget unless it's boosted. And gamification often has these elements of boosting learning. And that becomes really important if we want long-term behavioral change. So for example, let me give you an example. There was, from research, there was a group of 500 men in India. This research was conducted in India. And they were all pre-diabetic for type 2 diabetes. And diabetes is a behavioral disease. And so what happened was they broke that group of 500 men into two separate groups. One group, they gave traditional instruction on healthy lifestyle, how to eat right, how to take care of yourself if you have type 2 diabetes. The other group, all they did was send two behavioral messages a day, like don't sit on the couch and eat in front of the TV, or take the steps instead of the elevator, right? All of that kind of stuff. After 2 years, they looked at each group, and the group that had that drip learning, those boosters every day, the incidence of type 2 diabetes in that group was reduced by 36%. Just from text messages. No gamification, was just a reminder of what you needed to do. So it's really important to provide these boosters, especially in the area of safety. Whatever the mechanism is, people at a certain point, unless it's baked in to lots of different things, tend to drift away from the desired behavior. And the more they drift, the more dangerous it becomes. So if we can bring them back to that behavior after only a small drift, we can have a safer work environment. And we'll be talking about that as we go on today as well. So I wanted to stop, though, when we're talking about safety, to talk about the hierarchy of controls, because I want to stop any kind of misconceptions. So gamification is not going to solve every single safety problem that you have in your organization. If you've got managers or people that don't have a safety first culture, gamification is not a magic pill. It's not going to magically make everybody safer. It will make a difference, but if we look at the hierarchy of controls, this is put out by the Center for Disease Control and NOSH, the National Institute of Safety and Health. The best way to eliminate, the best way to ensure safety is to eliminate or remove a hazard. So for example, if there's a piece of machinery and it's very, very loud and it's causing noise pollution and it's hard to hear instructions from your um, coworkers, if you get a new piece of equipment that's much quieter, you've eliminated that noise hazard and you've made a safer environment. Substitution would be if you're using some chemical that's very dangerous, like acid, and you can replace it with something like vinegar. So that would be a substitution. You're replacing something that's very hazardous with something that's less or not hazardous at all. Or you put engineering controls in, right? You isolate the hazard from the people. So maybe you have barriers, or maybe you have a soundproof wall because you can't replace the equipment. Administrative controls is where you change the way people work. That's where gamification helps. In the administrative control, that's the training, that's the procedure, that's the policies. So we can make a big impact in administrative controls, but understand that administrative controls is one part of the bigger picture. So keep that in mind. And then, of course, PPE, which is personal protective equipment. So when you think about safety and you think about designing safety, the first thing you should do is think about elimination, substitution, and engineering controls, but don't neglect administrative controls, right? So it's all part of the process. I just don't want you to think like, oh, he thinks we can solve all safety problems with gamification. I do not think that. I think we have a narrow place. But I do think every safety protocol that we put in place, every injury we avoid, every incident we avoid is all good. So let's do what we can to make the environment as safe as we possibly can. So let's think of some elements for safety training. And I understand totally that this is not a safe image. I got it from ChatGPT to illustrate the point. You should not be up there servicing that wire in an electrical storm. But elements that we can use for safety gamification are challenge that I talked about before, story, different levels, this concept of distributed practice that I mentioned, providing visible rewards, focusing on behavior and exploration. So let's look at each of these and see an example of them. So first thing we want to do is provide a challenge. There's actually research that shows that people are more motivated to learn after they've overcome a challenge. So we want to create the instruction where people can overcome a challenge. So one organization that, so you might want to think about redesigning the instruction to start with the challenge. And one organization that did that was a company that made this training for mine safety called Harry's Hard Choices. Now, this is an environment. It was based on a paper-based situation. So it provides miners with instructions on what to do in case there's a cave-in, an emergency, a mine fire. And in this gamified experience, a learner assumes the role of a foreman tasked with evacuating a crew with this unfolding disaster. So the thought is, if we can get people to think about what could go wrong, we can think about them how to be safe in that environment, we can do that. Again, it was originally a paper-based activity, and then they put it into more of a simulated environment that mimics the actual situation that miners face. And I don't want you to just think about, oh, okay, well, gamification and mine safety, that works. I want you to think bigger, like what in your organization could you be used? So actually, if you have a moment, go ahead and type in, are you in the energy field? Are you in the medical field? Like what field are you in terms of thinking about safety? That would be helpful to me. So healthcare. So the bloodborne pathogens probably resonates. Retail safety. Yep. Biohazard. Okay. Biotech. HR, retail, education, manufacturing, processing safety. Okay. Academia. Great. So lots of different fields. So think about this. Harry's Hard Choices could be in any field, right? But what happens is you are a foreperson in the mine, and you have to help your fellow miners get out of a very dangerous, potentially fatal experience. So you start in with these 3D graphical folks. And there's a scoring system in there. The scoring system awards or deducts points based on your decisions. So during the fire, if you decide to make a bad decision, you will lose points. And what they found out was the first time many people go through this, they don't make the best decisions. But because they want to score better, they go back and do it again. So think about your safety training. How many times do people say, hey, I want to go back and do your safety training again? I hope they do, but it's not the norm. If it's happening, great. But this actually experience, people are like, hey, I want to go back. And one of the things that they did, which is really interesting, we'll cut to morale first, is they give a little bit of backstory behind all of your fellow miners. They want you to care about your fellow miners so that if one of them gets injured, incapacitated, or dies, you're like, oh, even though it's a character, so it's not a real person, but you kind of feel bad that person that was a result of your decision. So it adds this emotional impact. And we know that safety, and we know that training, when it's tied to emotion, can be a stronger driver than just tied to facts. So the scoring system is based on awarding or deducting points. Then you have this thing called hit points, like in games, which is how many times you're literally hit by a sword or shield or whatever. But here, it's how long you're exposed, what kind of level of exertion, right? So if a mine only has a particular situation, you've got to think about that, right? Yeah, exactly. You've died of dysentery, a good old Oregon Trail reference there. So we also want to put the character at risk. So one of the things that gamification does that people don't realize is it puts something at risk. And when we have something at risk, we care more about it. So for example, if you say, hey, if you answer this question wrong, you're going to lose 5 points, you'll spend more time on that question than you would ordinarily because you don't want to lose 5 points. In fact, there's research that show this is fascinating. So somebody put together a quiz at the end of content and said, you are going to be given a quiz. If you answer all 5 of the quiz questions correctly, you are done with the quiz. If you answer one of those questions incorrectly, you will get 5 more questions for a total of 10. And it was amazing the time people took then to do that quiz. A lot of times in safety training, people, play the game, like how fast can I hit next to go on? How quickly can I do this? How much time does it take to get this over with? But people took their time because they wanted not to have to answer 5 more questions. So just that little gamified technique of saying, hey, if you get them all right, you don't have to do any more, can have an impact. And also changing around the instruction every year. So I'll give you another safety example. I was working for a company that had fish kill. One of the gentlemen dumped chemicals into the drain, which eventually went out to the river and killed a bunch of fish. And so this was early on. They wanted to know, was e-learning the best way to teach people not to dump stuff into the drain? And the fascinating thing to me was we looked at the statistics of how long people were in this course talking about not dumping things down the drain, an average of 7 minutes. People were pretty much, they had to take it once a year. They were in there for about 7 minutes. 365 days, 7 minutes of the entire year. But when I interviewed people, I said, tell me what you remember, or what you recall, or what you know about the training about not dumping stuff. And people that have been there more than 2 years to a T said it was the same training every year. I thought to myself, that's pretty amazing. Like 7 minutes is all you're going to get of this training. And every year they remember it's the same training. So is that training effective? No. It's kind of like you're coming home from work and you drive home. You're like, I don't even remember how I got here, because you drive home every day and your mind kind of blocks it out because it's a routine thing. In fact, our minds are programmed to block out routine stuff so we have room for new stuff. So if you're doing safety training and you want to do it different, even if it's not totally gamified, change the scenarios every year, change the situation every year. The content can be the same, but the characters, the situation, the scenarios should be different because people, if they, oh, yeah, I saw this before, it's this one, right? Or, oh, no, it's not that one, it's this one. Okay, whatever, right? They're not as engaged. If you make it more interesting, you're good. So that's what you want to think about as you do that. So another thing that you want to think about was what was the results? Well, people said scale of 1 to 7, the higher the number, the better. People said it was wonderful. They thought this was a very satisfying learning experience. They thought it was exciting. They thought it was challenging. Remember the challenge. So that's one of the things that we need to think about. The other thing that I mentioned was story, right? Story is really important. It provides the context for the learner. So research shows actually that stories are naturally a way of conveying information, right? We have a natural affinity for stories. In fact, people tend to remember facts more accurately when they're in a story than as a bulleted list. And I always give the example, bulleted lists don't exist in nature. We as humans make them, but stories seem to exist in nature, right? You don't see a bulleted list hardly anywhere except at work, but stories are everywhere. And people rate legal arguments as more convincing when they're in a narrative. So when we go back to the experience of this story, you feel like, yeah, these are people that I really care about. This is something that I really want to do correctly. And you're immersed in that story from a gamified perspective. Again, it doesn't have to be full 3D simulated experience, but just adding a little bit of story to your safety training can be very helpful to have people realize what they need to do. The other really interesting thing about stories is that there was some research where they had people read a story in an MRI and they tracked the regions of their brains and found out that the areas of the brains that were in the story, like running or problem solving, actually highlighted as people were reading about it. So they weren't actually running or weren't actually solving problems, but they were reading about it. The same area in their brain was activated, which is really kind of interesting. It's almost as if the story was rehearsal for what the person needed to do. And think about the rehearsal of acting safely. And in fact, I always give the example, if you think of, I give the example of a football player. It could be European football, it could be American football. I'll use Tom Brady, American football. Tom Brady was at the very top of his game, the top of his game. Yet Tom Brady practiced every single day. By that time, he should know how to play football. He should know everything there is about football, but he still practiced every day. Why did he practice every day? Because he wanted it to be an automatic reaction. He didn't want to think about the pass to Gronkowski. He just wanted to do it. He didn't want to think about where the player would be. He just wanted to know where they were. Think about that from a safety perspective, right? We want to offer practice because if the person thinks about, oh, every time I operate this piece of machinery, I have to pull down this guard, or every time I do this, I have to put on gloves. You want them, and a mask. You want them to automatically put on you want them to be halfway through putting on their gloves and go, oh, yeah, I'm putting on gloves like I do all the time. Or, oh, I put this down like I do all the time, right? We want them to think safety automatically. The way to do that is through practice. So by giving gamified practice experiences, we're having people practice the safety procedures and protocols that we want to have in place. Now, another way to think about games is as levels. I don't know if you've ever played Donkey Kong, but it's got a lot of different levels to save the princess. And it's very effective because you can start at the beginning level and work your way up. We can do the same thing with safety training, right? A level, think of it as scaffolding. It's controlling the elements that are at first beyond the learner's capacity, and then the learner can figure out what to do. It's guided step by step. So here's an interesting piece of equipment, electrical equipment for an airplane antenna. And the training uses the gamification concept of levels. So if you don't know how to do it, you can do demonstration. You can practice it if you kind of know how to do it, and you can test yourself to see if you do it. Now, we know from the research that adult learners learn best when they know they don't know something. So I always think it's our job to let them know that they don't know something. And so what we've done is when people do this, they tend to actually go right to the test first, find out they don't know something, and then come back. So let's take a look at how this works. So at first, we're going to be in the demonstration mode. And it's going to demonstrate to me, I'm not touching it with my hands, how to actually do this. You click on next. The system itself grabs the piece of equipment and puts it where we should be, safely and effectively. Then it shows you how to turn it on. And then it's going to show you the right setting. So it gives you those instructions on what to do, how to set it up. If I know how to do it, I'm going to hit the practice mode. And the practice mode then is going to let me hook it up. But I can hit a hint. I'm not going to hit a hint right now. So where does this go? Okay, there it goes. I'm a little shaky. I think I might want a hint this time. And it gives me a hint. So now this is walking me through the safe use of this equipment so that I don't get hurt, so that I don't hurt any of my coworkers, and so that I don't hurt the equipment. Now I can go to the test mode and I get no feedback at all. Like there's no help, there's nothing. I turned on the power first, then I stick in the antenna, then I go ahead and do the right setting. Okay, that's good. Oh, I didn't do it correctly. I have to go back and I have to try it again. So this is a way that you can implement the idea of levels in games into your instruction by setting up those different levels and allowing people to do that. So think about adding that to help create a situation where the learner doesn't know of what they're supposed to be doing, and build that element in there. Okay, so distributed practice, and that kind of answers Mark's question as well. Distributed practice is when we do something over time. It turns out, well, let me ask this question. How many of you have ever crammed for an exam? Anybody here ever cram for an exam? Oh, yeah, right. I mean, and did you ace it? Did you ace the exam? Right. I love it. Is there any other way? Yeah. So we were all taught that cramming makes a lot of sense and that's the way we do it. And you know what? Cramming is great for immediate recall, right? The next day we probably all aced the test. But what it's not good for is long-term recall. In fact, there is a whole group of research around something called desirable difficulties. And desirable difficulties is the idea that we actually want to slow down the learning process. We don't want it to be quick. Why? Because if we slow it down and make it harder to understand, then we have made more neural pathways to that information. We've made more ways to think about that content. We make it harder to encode, makes it easier to retrieve. So how can we do that? Well, there's a couple different ways to do that. And one is repetition. So here's a little game on Department of Transportation, safety signs and elements. And this is a little game, and there's a bunch of different games. There's about 3 or 4, and they all come up on a person's, the field technician's iPad, and they go through the game. And this is part of their training. So they've had the training, like you have the formal training that you have to have, but this is that little booster that I talk about. And it boosts that information every week. And so it brings it up to the forefront of a person's thought processes so that you can tackle the safety information. Here's another way that an organization has done this. This is kind of interesting. This is a digital card game that can go to your laptop, it can go to your tablet, etc. And this is on safety elements. So the player, each person gets this once a day, right? So it's just a once a day reminder of safety things. And you click it, it's called Factor Fishy. A utility worker should always inform their supervisor or team before climbing a utility pole, right? And so I say, is that fact or is that fishy, right? So I would say fact. And it just asks me a bunch of questions, gives me a little bit of sense of urgency. Following established safety protocols reduces the risk of accidents when working on, of course it does, that's a fact. And it doesn't have to be, the thing I want to point out is it doesn't have to be like a huge stumper question, right? Most accidents are a result of two or more points of failure, right? So most traffic accidents, for example, I'm speeding down the road and you don't come to a full stop and our car's hit, right? If I had not been speeding, or if you had come to a full stop, maybe there wouldn't be that accident. But a lot of times, a safety accident is a breakdown of two or more items happening. So we don't need to tell people about the most obscure, weird, strange safety thing that would happen. We need to remind of the fundamentals. So you really don't have to come up thinking of like really difficult questions. They should be from your content. They should be and then you send this out. The folks do it on their phone or do it on a laptop, and they gain that type of information or that knowledge. So it can be very helpful to do those boosters that I talked about before. Okay. Also then, visible rewards. So if we're going to do a badging system or a reward system, we want to have what are called expected achievements, which meaning we want the learner to know if you do this, you'll earn a badge, because that's goal setting, because that's what we want you to do. That's the behavior we want to modify, right? We want to have expected achievements. Now, every once in a while, you can do an unexpected, like, hey, you earned 5 badges in a row. You didn't know you were going to get this. Here's the 5 badge award. Like, you can do that. But the main thing you want to think about is if you do this right, you will earn this badge. That provides motivation, that provides goals, that provides incentive. I already talked about coins, points, and rewards to provide feedback, right? Did you do this 100% correctly? You get 10 points, or a little bit correctly, you get 5 points. How do you modify that or make that particular change? And then in your gamified system, you want to give players, in this case learners, an opportunity to review and even display their badges, trophies, etc. Remember how I said self-determination theory? One of the elements was relatedness, which was peer pressure. We all like to have an ability to show off something that we've done well. We always like to bragging rights. So if you're going to set up the system, you want to have these elements in place so you can provide bragging rights, so you can provide somebody to go over this. So you want to make sure that you do that. Now, you also want to do your training with discrete, measurable objectives. So what do I mean by that? One of the mistakes most people make with gamification is they gamify a goal. Like, we're going to reduce safety incidences. Well, guess what? If people already knew how to reduce safety incidences, they would be reducing safety incidences. So to create a leaderboard, like the group that has the fewest safety incidences or the most safety avoidances, isn't really the best way to modify behavior, because yeah, we all want to do that and we kind of know what we need to do, but what we want to do is get to very specific measurable things. So reporting near misses or reporting incidences, the team that reports those, that's a behavior you want to reinforce, because if you're having near misses, after a while, a near miss becomes an actual hit. You don't want that. So reporting that, resolving that, like taking corrective actions if you're qualified, that's important things to gamify. So again, so the one thing I want you to take away is don't gamify the end goal, right? Gamify the behaviors that contribute to that end goal. Maybe the behavior is wearing personal protective equipment. Maybe the behavior is pre-job briefings so people know what the dangers are before they undertake the job, right? Maybe it's a host of things. That maybe it's telling your team that you're ascending the utility pole. Maybe it's making sure that you're wearing gloves and a mask so that you avoid bloodborne pathogens, right? You want to get to the behaviors that lead to safety, not simply safety. And it's a little bit of a distinction, semantic maybe, but it's really important to focus on behaviors, not outcomes. If you focus on the right behaviors and enough of those, you will get the outcome that you want. So here's an example from lifting. I did a very behavioral one, but the goal here is to safely lift the box without hurting our back, right? So we've got a certain way to do that. We would not gamify safely lifting a box. What we gamify is when you bend at your hips, or when you spread your legs widely, or having knowledge, right? First, you have to have knowledge, of course, but then you actually have to do it. And somebody, I think Mark asked the question, like, how do you help physical behaviors? Well, you set up things like this. Here is a behavioral exercise that maybe every day you have a little bit of a contest of, let's see who can most properly lift a box. Let's see how high. Okay, today you're going to lift it 38 inches, tomorrow 68, and you practice that every day for 5 minutes before you get to the job site, right? Before you actually do the why is that? And you get points if you do it every day. And why is that? Because you're incentivizing the right physical behavior. You're helping people understand what they should be doing, and you're giving them practice situations. So that becomes very important. So think about gamifying the behaviors that lead to the outcome, not necessarily just the outcome. It's important to keep the outcome in mind. Don't go. I want to be we're nuanced here, right? We're not doing either or. We're doing, okay, this is what we're doing, but we're trying to be safety. We're trying to lift the box safely. But in order to do that, we're going to have to bend at the hips and knees. We're going to have to spread our legs wide so we have a good stance, right? We have to do that. So that's a good thing to gamify. The problem is we always gamify lifting a box or lack of safety incidences, and we're like, oh, we're happy we did. But people that already know how to do it are doing it. Well, we want to impact the behavior of everyone. So here's how it would align in a gamified kind of environment, right? So here's the desired behavior, bending at the hips. Here's my measurable objective, learning objective, while loading a package car, the employee will. And then I'm going to reward that with points when they bend at the knees, loading the car. They're going to earn a badge when I see them do it 10 times correctly, right? So I'm starting to get that kind of content and information. That's how you want to set up your gamify. Look for the desired on-the-job safety behavior, figure out the learning objective, behavior or performance objective, and then figure out how you're going to gamify it based on those things that we saw earlier, right? The points, the characters, the story, the challenge. Exploration is another great way. So here, for example, is an area where I have to identify all the potential hazards with a flag before I dig, right? So here's a hazard. Here's some flags indicating perhaps an underground cable. Here's high wires. So how this gamified experience works is an employee, before they go on the construction site, who is involved with digging, has to complete this quick little game, right? But it's reinforcing what they know about where to look and how to dig and how to identify it. But it's just a reminder on the work site to be safe and how to do that effectively. And that can be a very quick and very engaging experience. Here's another exploration. This is for lab safety. This happens to be lab safety in a veterinarian environment. But the idea here is you as the learner go through the different elements in the veterinary hospital, and you have to look for the right safety elements. So here, for example, I'm just going to show you, this is taught film with 360 video. So you talk to somebody about what happens in the room, and then you explore the room looking for safety hazards. And if you find the safety hazards, you earn points for finding those particular safety hazards. You can look all around and you can see what parts of the room does, and you can look at this to get a sense of what is it like to be there before you're actually there, or every day. And they have areas that you can unlock. So you can unlock a treatment room. So you have to identify the areas first that then you can progress. So that's another gamified element, right? This exploration and this locking down of what you're able to do or not able to do. And that can be very helpful from a learner perspective. And literally a 360-degree camera to shoot 360 video is, we made it with a 360 camera that cost less than $500. And you put it in the middle of the room, and then you leave the room, and it takes a picture. And it's a 3D virtual picture of the top, the floor, and the sides. And then we exported that, in this case, into Storyline. And then we overlaid Storyline elements on top of it. Now, there's also another tool that does this really well called Scenario VR that does it as well. And it's set up specifically to do that also, and can record that type of information. Scenario is a very powerful virtual reality tool. So the real trick is to get that 360 camera, which is, compared to 10 years ago, pennies, right? Costs hardly anything. You set it up, you can put it in a factory, you can put it in a lab, you can put it wherever you need to. So what are kind of results? Well, I don't have a ton of results to show because most people won't show them. But here is a result. This is a tool called Exonify. But notice they gamified a warehouse. This was a warehouse application. And they gamified it and reduced safety incidences by 54%. So these using gamification can be a very effective methodology for reducing safety incidences. Why? Because it's a reminder, it provides engagement, it can shape behavior, it can help teams, right? If you're like, hey, we all have to do these safety things together, and you use peer pressure to help people behave more safely for the good of themselves, their coworkers, and the organization. And gamification can be an effective tool for having that happen. So in conclusion, I wanted to leave some time open for questions. When you think about gamifying your safety training, so we went from a lightning storm, notice, to a sunny day, we want to think about how can we challenge the learner, right? Make them really think about their responsibility for safety. Put it into context. Like, what, like, why do I need to learn this? Well, you need to learn this because of this kind of situation could occur. Think of levels where you can show somebody what they don't know and make them more open to what they need to know. Use distributed practice. And if you use gamified elements like, hey, you earn a couple points every day, the points are the motivation to do this activity on a daily basis. And when they do that, provide visible rewards. People like visible rewards. Make sure you're focusing on the behaviors that lead to safety, not just, be safe or reduce incidences. No. Here's what you do to reduce, here's the behavior you do. Put on your gloves, put on your mask, tell your teammates, that kind of stuff. And then finally, use exploration to test things and to do things. Yeah, Lectora is a good way to do that as well. So that is my presentation on safety and gamification. I left a few moments for questions. So I don't know, Mark, if you're satisfied with the answer I gave, but one of the things that we've done is we had this little tiny, not tiny, but every day we had, for lifting, a chart on the wall, and the folks would come in and they would have an observer, and they would do the correct lifting, and then they would get points for lifting, and they were practicing that behavior. So anytime you can put together a situation where people are practicing the right behavior, that's the way to do it. It never ceases to amaze me. When I was young, they would say, Carl, you need to practice to get better. And I'm like, yeah, I know. And I practiced, and guess what? I got better. And then you get to a work environment, and you're like, yeah, I know how to do this. I don't need any practice. But if Tom Brady practices, the best football player in the world practices, then, maybe Carl, should practice, right? And that's what you need to think about. Practicing skills, setting up situations where people can practice is what you want to do. And again, open to questions. Thanks everyone for your feedback. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I hope it helps. Really, I hope it helps keep people safe. That's what we want to do. We want to use these elements, use these ideas to keep ourselves, our coworkers, our organizations, and our community safe. Safety first. So thanks everybody, and have a great and safe day.
Yes, yes. I was gonna say we do have a few questions for those who want to stay. But thanks again. Yeah, let's just get it started. So Virgil did have a few questions and they did want to shout out and say thanks for the great info. But they asked, how many alternative endings do you suggest when using a branching scenario in gamification?
Oh, wow. That's a start out with a tough question. Um, I think that really, I try to think of branching simulations in a bunch of different ways. And in fact, I have a course on LinkedIn Learning on branching scenarios. And I think there's different types. You could do it depends a little bit on the criticality and the resources that you have. So if you don't have a lot of resources, and my friend Clark Aldridge does something, he calls them short sims. So basically in a short sim, you make one decision and you're either binary, you're either right or you're wrong. And it gives you feedback on that. So that's one way to do it. Do it short. You just have this experience and the person makes the right decision or doesn't make the right decision. They see the consequences right away. Um, I tend to think about maybe three alternative endings are probably the best, right? You have a great outcome, you have a horrible outcome, and you have kind of an outcome in the middle. You could have variations of that, maybe four or whatever, but I think people get the point. If you have a great outcome, a bad, horrible outcome, and you have kind of not the best outcome, but not the worst outcome. But again, it depends. Like in a mine disaster, you might want to have several outcomes. Like you live, but your colleagues don't, right? That's a horrible outcome. Everybody dies. That's the worst outcome. Everybody lives. That's the best outcome. Or somebody gets injured. That's not the best outcome, but nobody's dead. So maybe four types of branching endings are probably good. But again, you have to use your resources and you have to think about the severity of the safety situation.
Perfect. No, perfect. They also did ask, I believe it was during while you were showing something, so there might be a little bit more context that maybe they can put, but it said, did you use Storyline for the electronics interactive? Was the question.
Um, so we used a combination of PowerPoint and Storyline for that. Yes, but it doesn't have to be. I want to be tool agnostic. So, for example, we could have used Captivate, we could have used Lectora, we could have used iSpring, we could have used a bunch of different tools. It's really the concept of the different levels. But for that particular one, we did use Storyline. But again, any of the modern tools can branch, can add different levels. They can all do it. What you're comfortable with, I would just say use that.
Perfect. Now, Tasneem, kind of similar to Mark's question, but dived a little bit deeper. What suggestions do you have for frontline workers that can't easily access digital training, like retail workers or warehouse workers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we've gotten away a little bit from I've worked with organizations. We've used laminated job aids. We've used laminated posters. We've done pre-shift briefings and post-shift briefings to help remember that. And we've even done some situations where we have a practice. Before work today, we're going to practice two safety things, right? We're going to practice lifting, and we're going to practice safe operation of the forklift, right? And just a few minutes before the shift can really help people bring that safety to the front of mind. And I think like a lot of times we'll do safety briefings and we'll say, hey, here's a safety briefing, et cetera. And we'll tell people, but we all know that when we touch something, it tends to recall better. So if you actually have an exercise where don't tell me how to lift the box, have everybody before the shift lift the box. Don't tell me how to, put on the mask and gloves for a sterile environment. Have me do that as a practice. So make the practice as physical as you can if you don't have the digital opportunities. And
Love.
You will get pushback. Don't get me wrong. Everybody's like, I don't need to do this. I don't need to practice. So gamification says, hey, if you do this 5 days in a row, you'll get half an hour extra lunch break, or you'll get a $5 Starbucks, or you'll get whatever. That's where the gamification comes in and can be helpful.
Perfect. No, I need to be about that. I would 100% do something for a $5 Starbucks. So,
Yes, almost anyone would.
well, I think that is all the questions we have, and we are right on time. So perfect. Thank you so much, Carl, for all this. We had a very engaging audience. This was super, super interesting. So we appreciate it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So everyone else, I do invite you to join for some up and coming training industry webinars this month. You can see them here below. We have a really cool Spanish one about just like training in the Spanish realm. So that one's really interesting. If you're interested, you can register for these programs and watch past webinars now at trainingindustry.com. All of our webinars are pre-qualified for a credit hour by HRCI, SHRM, ISPI, and CPTM. And if you're wondering what CPTM, it is the Certified Professional and Training Management Program that assists you in developing core competencies that will empower you to manage the future training needs of your organization. You can participate in several programs held with us in the US or join us for a virtual practicum from anywhere in the world. We would also love to meet you in person in Raleigh, North Carolina for 2024 TICE. It's about 3 weeks, so it's coming up real soon. This is where learning leaders like you gather to forge new professional connections and learn from each other and address all your most pressing learning challenges. Lastly, that evaluation survey should have popped open in another tab in your browser, and we would appreciate hearing your feedback from today's session. Thanks again to today's speaker, Carl, and our sponsor, ELB Learning. Lastly, thank you for your time and attention today. See you next time. Bye, everybody.